Onto the tone section of Lightroom, and this is probably the first place you want to go when starting to edit your image. But just make sure you enable profile corrections to correct the vignetting from your lens. Otherwise, your image might appear a bit darker around the edges. You don't want to make all your adjustments before realizing you haven't done that yet. Okay, so the exposure slider is the overall brightness of your image. It would be like lifting up all four of these sliders at once. The contrast slider would be like moving down the shadows and the blacks while moving up the highlights and whites, darkening the darker areas and brightening the brighter areas, creating a harsher contrast between the brights and the darks. Okay, just to go over that again, here we have exposure, and exposure being the overall brightness of your image. So if we were to bring that up, it would be very similar to bringing up the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, bringing up all your tones at once. So, and here we have the contrast. So if we were to bring up the contrast, it'd be very similar to bringing down your darks, so the blacks and shadows, and bringing up your whites and highlights, your brights, at the same time. Now, don't let these controls confuse you. The highlights, the shadows, the whites, the blacks, they mean exactly what they say they do. You can see if we play around with these, you can see the exact areas they are affecting. So the highlights affect the brighter parts of the image, the shadows, the darker, shadier parts of the image. The whites will affect the very, very brightest parts of your image, and the blacks, the darkest of dark areas of your image. So pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory, but what can confuse people about the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks is that they can sometimes affect the same area on an image. I'll try to show you and explain. So if we just play with the highlights and then look at the whites, you can sort of see that they affect the same area, and to beginners it might be hard to know which one to shift. Even sometimes the shadows and highlights can affect the same area to quite a bit, not so much in this image, but sometimes they do. And I explain this as they kind of overlap just a little bit. So the highlights will affect a little bit of shadows, and the shadows will affect a little bit of the highlights. So if I just show you, if you put your mouse over on the highlights here, you can see up in the histogram, it shows you where the highlights are on the histogram. We'll talk more about the histogram very shortly. And then if we go shadows, you can see on the histogram where the shadows are, whites and blacks. So again, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. It shows you on the histogram where they are. And a simple way to try to show you what I mean by they overlap with each other is a simple diagram that I made to show you guys. So we've got exposure right in the middle, and then if we just go back and put my mouse over exposure, it shows right in the middle there, exposure. Takes up a large space, it affects most of the image. And then if we go over highlights again, shadows, whites, and blacks. So yeah, if we look back at this little diagram that I drew, sort of shows that there is an overlap between the shadows and highlights and the blacks and the shadows. They kind of affect the same areas just a little bit. There's a little bit of overlap. So don't let that confuse you. So if you move highlights, for example, and then you move whites, just remember the whites will affect the brighter parts, and same with the shadows. The shadows will affect a bit more of the shadows. They will affect the blacks also, but the blacks will affect the very dark blacks much more, but they will also boost the shadows a little. So don't let that confuse you. And yeah, moving on. So how do we use these sliders to get a well exposed image? So it comes down to what style you're going for. But to make a general nice looking image, there's some obvious things that need to be done. And different lighting scenarios would require a different approach. You want to start off with brightening your image to a good starting point. So you want to brighten it with the exposure slider. Just don't go past the point where you overexpose your brights. A concept you want to do in camera as well, exposing for the highlights. So you can tell when you're overexposing when you look at the histogram. The histogram is a tool to help you gauge the brightness of your image because you can't always trust your eye. This is a brightness measuring tool you can always refer back to at any time to get consistent results, especially as a beginner. Some of your edits will be way too dark, some will be way too bright, but this will help you be very consistent. This end represents the brightest parts of your image, and this side the darker parts of your image. In general, if you aren't trying to create a particular style, you want to maximize your dynamic range. And to do so, you want your whites to be close to this end and your blacks to be very close to this end, but not touching. By doing this, you have the most detail possible in the bright areas while getting the most detail possible in the dark areas also. And if you click this point, it will show you when you overexpose your bright areas. Often people say never ever overexpose your image because you'll lose detail. It's true, but it's okay if you overexpose the middle of the sun, for example, lamps and lights that contain no detail anyway or have no importance to the image. So the height of this histogram means the amount of that tone. In this image you can see there's a lot more shadows, a lot more blacks, and not many highlights and whites. And if we go over to another one, you can see it's the opposite, way more whites, way more highlights, and not as many blacks and shadows. So if we carry on exposing this image, okay, let's edit this image with as little changes as possible. So let's tick these boxes here so we can see when we're underexposing with the blue and when we're overexposing with the reds. Okay, so what I'll do first is that the image is pretty dark overall, so I'm going to bring up the exposure to get to a good starting point. I think that's about good there, and obviously our sky is very bright, so I'm going to bring down the highlights just so it's not so harsh. And then I'm the subject of the image, so I need to make sure I am able to be seen. I'm a bit shadowy, so let's bring up the shadows. And I think that looks pretty good there. And then if you look at our histogram, we look pretty good there too. We aren't touching the whites, so we'll get plenty of detail. We're not overexposing there. And in the blacks also, we aren't underexposing. So nice and stretched out. You want to be close but not touching, and you get the most dynamic range possible. You might ask, why did I drop the highlights and not the whites? Well, I find when you drop the whites a lot, you lose the pop to your image. It's a bit of an advanced concept, so I don't want to get too much into that now, but dropping the highlights does a really good job of softening up those really bright areas, shadows up, just so I can be seen in the image as I'm the subject. Okay, let's move on to a darker exposed image. Okay, for this one we'll make sure these are checked as well, and then we'll come down and we'll make sure we do profile corrections for this one because we have a pretty strong vignette. You can see that really brightens it. Let's come back up. So we're obviously very underexposed. Let's expose it to a good starting point. And now when you bring up exposure, and since we've brought up exposure a lot, the image will lose its contrast. So let's increase the contrast, and what that's going to do is drop the blacks, drop the shadows, up the whites, up the highlights. So it will darken the darker areas, brighten the brighter areas. So I'm going to lift this up quite a bit. We get our contrast back, and then we are pretty good. Our blacks are pretty close but not touching, and the whites are pretty close but not overexposing. They're overexposing back there, and those lights way back there, but that's okay. Don't stress about those. They're not important to the image, and they have no detail anyway. So those little red markers, if we turn our box on and off, they are okay to overexpose. What I might do is drop the highlights because his shirt is very bright. And watch what happens when I drop the highlights. You can see his shirt much better. You can see the detail in his shirt. So I'm going to drop that. And then just to make sure I keep a good pop to the image, I'm going to bring up the whites. So there's good shine, but we can still see that detail in the shirt because we dropped the highlights. So the brightest of brightest areas, still not going all the way. So if we turn this back on, still not going all the way. About there. And then blacks. Got our black one turned on, so we just don't want that blue to be visible. There, give it a bit of extra room. And then, yeah, that's a well exposed image with a good amount of contrast. And then it's all up to style. If you wanted to bring the shadows up, shadows down. I think that one's good. Let's move on. Later on in the course there'll be full videos on how to create unique styles, but I just want to go over some simple concepts right now in the tone tools. So if you want to create a warm looking image, consider bringing up your shadows. Makes sense, like a warm environment doesn't have many shadows. So if we bring up our shadows, you can really see how that really creates a warm vibe to your image. And then also bringing up the whites can create a nice brightness to your image, a real pop that also gives a warm feeling to your image. And if you want to go for a cooler, moodier style, consider bringing down your shadows and your whites. So doing the exact opposite. So bringing down the whites, creating less pop to your image, and bringing down the shadows just to make it darker and cooler and less vibrant. If we just look at our before and after of that, quite a bright original image, and then we've made it quite a bit darker and moodier by bringing down shadows and whites, especially highlights as well, creating that nice flat dark moody look. Filters and brushes are also a really good way to isolate exposure changes. We'll have a whole video on them later on. Okay, to summarize this video, we went over how to expose your image using the histogram. So we're not overexposing our highlights, we're not underexposing our blacks. And do I use the histogram? Not really, because my YouTube tutorials, for example, I'm trying to create a unique style. So when it comes to creating a creative, unique style, the histogram sort of doesn't really matter. Some people purposely overexpose their images, some people purposely underexpose, some have very little contrast. So when it comes to that, the histogram sort of doesn't matter, but it's a really, really good starting point for beginners and is a really handy tool to know to begin. So you want a high dynamic range image, lots of detail in it. You don't want to lose any detail in your highlights or your blacks. And it's a really solid place to start and a really important thing to understand. So that wraps up this one, guys. See you in the next one.